You might ask a question not for yourself, but in fact be a little bit of a mentor yourself to those folks. Maybe some particulars. How do I decide? Or how do I choose a different advisor than the one I originally chose? What I've done. What happens if somebody doesn't cite my paper? What happens if I wear the wrong thing to a conference? I don't know. Other things. I'm sure you could think of lots of other things. What's it like? How do I know when I'm ready to be done? What if my advisor doesn't think I'm done and I do think I'm done? What if I don't think I'm done but my advisor thinks I'm done? Um, How can I find out about lots of different jobs? What are interviewing for some of those jobs like? So on, lots of things to ask about. As specific as possible would be awesome. So if you know some scenario back home where you could use some advice or your friend could use some advice, that would be great. Think back on all the things we talked about today. This is really your chance to get sort of a condensed conversation going, lots of advice from folks who have been all through all this before, who are awesome folks, and really care about this community, about you being a part of this community, where this community could be programming languages, but it could also be the larger community of scholars. We really care about making this a great place, continuing to make it a great place. So I hope you come up with some great questions to give you some time to think. Let that go in the back of your mind. Maybe I will now ask the panelists to come grab this microphone over here. So just very briefly, maybe 20 seconds, just your name, where you went to grad school, when you finished, and then we'll have another question. We'll come back to a bit just quick introduction.
Hi, so I'm Sam. I did grad school at University of Colorado in Goal Director Program Analysis. I graduated last year in May, just about a year ago, and I started at Facebook this past October.
Hi, I'm Jean. I finished my PhD at MIT last September. I'm starting a faculty position at Carnegie Mellon this fall. I've been at Harvard Medical School in the interim.
Hi, I'm Chugh. I did my PhD and postdoc at UC San Diego. Finished a couple years ago there, and I've been at the University of Chicago since.
Hi, I'm Cindy. I finished my PhD at the University of Wisconsin in Madison back in 2012. Then I spent a couple of years doing a postdoc at UC Berkeley. And now I am at UC Davis. I'm an assistant professor. I started in November 2014.
Hi, my name is Alvin Cheung. I finished PhD from MIT last year in the same group as Jane. And now I'm at the AlBassam Programming Languages and Software Engineering group at the University of Washington, starting last year.
Hang on to the mic there. So one stop question for all the panelists before you ask. Maybe max 2 minutes. So what's one thing you wish you had known before starting grad school?
Okay, well, I guess I need to be a little bit careful because my advisor Armando is sitting here in the in the audience. Okay, he promised that he won't be listening. So I would say like two things perhaps when I first started grad school that I wish I knew. One is how a grad student actually gets evaluated in terms of like what makes a good grad student, what doesn't make as strong as in terms of a grad student. And the other one that I wish I knew was how do I know when I'm actually done in terms of finishing up. So I went in completely semi-naive, didn't know what's going to happen, and then at the end of n number of years, suddenly I got the scoop basically saying that okay, now it's time up. You're going to you're going to be like getting out into the real world. I'm like, okay, I'm not really prepared for that, but then I'll try. So I wish I knew about that when I was done.
Okay, for me, I guess I wish I had known that I shouldn't have stressed out about classes so much and about grades, and instead focus more on my research from the beginning. I think that would have been helpful. Also to help me choose classes more strategically later on that actually helped my research. So that would be one thing. And maybe I will add the second one, which is the importance of networking during the first few years. So I wish I had participated in more student research competitions and events for junior students. So that's something I wish I had done different.
So I think one thing that I wish I had done differently earlier in grad school is thinking a little bit more about how I kind of structure my schedule, like how many hours I would work and what days I would work, and the fact that I wasn't like not taking weekends off, things like that. I wish I had thought about that much earlier, because I think one thing in grad school is that, like Matthias was saying, you kind of fall in love with your problem and your project, and you can kind of put all of your time into it, which is great and it's good. But it's not necessarily sustainable. Staying up very late all the time, and you're not going to always be creative at 3 a.m. in the morning. All the time. You need a break. You need balance. You need to have the rest of your life too. And that's something that I don't think I started off with a good foot. And I think only later did I realize that you kind of need to create that space so that when you do work, you have the creative ideas that you need to have and want to have, and that putting in more hours doesn't always lead to like more results, more papers, that kind of thing. And it can feel like that sometimes, because like there is kind of a correlation between your effort and like the products that you get to like present and publish and things like that. And so it kind of feels like putting in more hours always is the best. And I think it's easy to realize that it's not. And so I think it's important to kind of make sure that you're setting up kind of a schedule and a plan that makes you successful, and be willing to kind of evaluate that and set up what you think works well for you.
So I think the thing that I most wish I knew was that being good at research is not some kind of innate genius quality, but it has to do with how much skill you have in managing a project, in writing up your research, in who your collaborators are, and how lucky you got choosing a problem. Because I think a lot of my friends and I just spent a lot of grad school angsting and waiting for that moment when we magically became good at research. And if we had just spent that time doing these other things, it would have helped a lot more.
Yeah, so my thing is just an extension of something that a lot of people already touched on, especially in Catherine's talk, about the social aspect of research. But the thing I wanted to specifically call out is not just about like networking and meeting people in the social aspect, but the importance of forming deep friendships and really taking the time to do that, which is different than just meeting a lot of people. Just that it makes you so much happier and you'll enjoy grad school so much more. And when you join the PL community, like we've talked about research and life, like deciding to do a PhD and do research and join this community means that it's going to be a big part of your life. And you want to have these friends that you're really excited to see them when you go to conferences, or people in your lab that you have these long-lasting relationships with that you'll just enjoy for all of that time. I think it's just really easy for me anyway to get into this trap where you're eating lunch at your desk and like grinding really hard and not really worrying about talking to people and just focusing on doing work. And I would just encourage you to always take a step back from that and think about just your happiness and meeting other people and connecting with them in a deep way.
You all, who has a question? I might give you some advice.
So we mentioned that getting a PhD, you have some students that are doing well, some students that aren't. What is that factor that determines that this is a good grad student and this is not? And second of all, since this is a long process, how do you know that you're doing well, like in between?
Something I noticed is that in the beginning of grad school, there are professors who will definitely decide this is a good grad student and this is not. And often that changes a lot by the end of grad school. So I think, so I think people have their idea about what makes someone good, if they seem like they're sharp, if they're a good communicator, if they're getting work done. But this can change, well, some of this can change year to year and things like that. And I think that one thing I would say is just because someone has not decided that you're a good grad student does not mean that you're not going to be a good grad student. And as for, wait, what was the second part of your question? Yeah, so I think your advisor should be the one to tell you if you're on the right track. And I think there's some external measures, like if you are publishing at some point, but I think in the first few years it's hard to tell that. I think if you're able to communicate about your work and you're making progress on that, I think a tricky thing is in the beginning it's hard to have these external things because it looks different for everybody. But your advisor should be a good person to tell you that. But for some people, I guess their advisors are kind of hands off. So I think seeking out other mentors, senior graduate students, can be very helpful in that regard. But again, everybody has their idea of what makes a good grad student, and that might not be the final word on that.
So I don't think I can speak from too much data because I have one student, so he's by definition my best and worst student. But no, more seriously, so I should mention, I think all of my advice is better said by Matt Might, who's in the back, who's already mentioned, several tips about kind of presentations. His blog is full of great advice, and so my advice to you is read his blog. And so actually what I'll say in response to your question is something that I read in his blog a long time ago, in that what makes a good graduate student is one who solves problems, whether an advisor or somebody else kind of identifies one. And what makes a great grad student is one who identifies great problems to work on. And I think it naturally takes time to go from a good student to a great student with that definition. And so I think, it's a process where, early on in grad school, probably you're getting a little bit more guidance from your advisor about, maybe what problem to work on, maybe what initial ideas to, try out, while you're also kind of formulating your own ideas and, learning to kind of shape your own research direction. I think that is just kind of a natural process that, hopefully, goes upward over time at, some reasonable rate.
So I just would like to add. So I think that's something also very important is taking initiative. So you can, distinguish students by the ones who do take initiative and the ones that don't. So I think that's a very nice quality to have. And the second one is, I think, being optimistic about what you're doing. So even when you face a rejection, seeing the positive side of it and pushing yourself to improve.
I think those are all very excellent comments. I think one thing that I might add as a meta comment is you should also ask yourself, what do you think is a good grad student? What makes a good student? What makes yourself a good student yourself, for instance, right? So, for instance, in my case, I always try to ask myself when I was a grad student whether I'm learning something new every year. Because after all, you're spending 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, right, in school, where you could have been spending time elsewhere, get an industrial job, for instance, and earning millions, for instance, right? So there must be a reason why you decide to stay in school, right? So, and I hope the reason is because it's not because your advisor is asking you to do so. So, that basically means there must be a reason. For instance, you like to learn, you like to, solve new problems, you try to investigate or push beyond the frontiers of science, right? To use kind of like a generic term. So I think in that sense, it makes sense for you to evaluate, every year, how much have you learned over that year? Do you think you have improved over your last year, and so on and so forth, right? It's one thing about how other people evaluate you as a grad student, but it's also another thing about how you evaluate yourself. So I think that's also one of the important things that you should consider.
Hi, I just want to ask, what's your advice about narrowing down your thesis statement for a problem statement? And second, as a grad student, you might have experienced whatever difficulties or a pleasant phase to narrow down it very easily about your thesis statement. And what do you think if you reflect back on your grad school time? Oh yeah, if I would have done this, it would have been much easier to narrow down my thesis statement in this way. I will include Matthias later in the next question because I have the ideal advice from him last year. So I'll ask the counter question next time. I want to hear from you first.
The process to narrow down the research statement, you mean? Is your first question, right? Mm-hmm. I can share my experience. So it was a struggling phase. It took long, so it wasn't one day one day process. So I would say that how can I put this? It's a process of refinement. So you will find many times that, oh, I would like to do this, and then you find that someone already did it, And then you keep doing the process, and at some point you will reach the point at which, okay, nobody has looked at this. But it's a long process, and I think that knowing that beforehand is important because, yeah, because it requires patience. So I think um, talking to more people about what I wanted to do would have sped up the process. Because I spent a lot of time, well, talking to my advisor and reading papers, but I think that if I had talked to other people, the process would have been a lot smoother.
Yeah, at least for me, thesis statement was more of a narrative I told about the work I did after the fact rather than something you plan out in advance. And I think when you read a thesis, it's easy to think like, oh, like, in year one, they thought they would do this thing, they knew in year two they'd do this thing, in year three, and so on. But I think that's just not the nature of research, and that's okay. It's an exploratory process, and like you'll do something and you'll say, oh, actually this could be generalized in this way, and then when you write your thesis, you'll say it makes sense to present the general framework first, and then talk about the instantiations or something like that. And that's not something to avoid. It would be great if you knew all what to do in advance, but some amount of uncertainty is to be expected.
I can also add that at the end you might end up doing something different, and that's okay too. So in my case, I ended up doing part of what I wanted to do because it just turned out that it was a lot of work, and that was fine.
To give you a concrete example, I remember writing the statement for one of the government fellowships. I'm not going to say which one, but the day I finished the statement, the second day I decided that it was completely garbage, and I just never worked on it at all. But I still ended up getting the fellowship, so that tells you how much of a process you actually need to go through.
Dr. Matias, you mentioned about the PhD process, like when one should be ready to go for PhD. So that was a very idealistic process that you have to go through list of papers, list of professors, and then decide like, okay, which is the most fascinating one or two or three areas for you, right? And that's like a 1 year whole process. I really admire that. Now I actually tell people who make a decision to do PhD to go through this process very, very seriously. So I believe that this was an ideal process, and probably I didn't go through it so seriously at that time. I don't regret of doing PhD now, but still I wish like, okay, when I started PhD I should have known much more about beyond deciding that okay, I want to go into the compilers, but what exactly in compilers, what more. So that was a question for Matthias. So I was just thinking like, okay, that was the ideal case which I got to know from him. And is it the ideal thing with all of you, or is it the iterative process that even I am going through?
So I have a professor from undergrad who says that you should be wary of advice because most of it is highlights and wishful thinking. And looking back on my PhD, there are lots of confusing parts, but I don't think I would have changed it because I think without those confusing parts, I wouldn't have reached where I ended up. So I spent a lot of time wondering if the topic that I was working on should really be my thesis. And it ended up being my thesis, but not without me spending internships, trying out other things. There was a period of time when Armando had me attending these material science meetings where the whole project got canceled because it was based on like fiber optic many core machines. And I was like, oh yeah, I have lots of ideas for this. Maybe I should switch my thesis topic to this. But I kept working on my thesis for years, but the whole time every day I thought maybe I should switch to something else. And in retrospect, it's really easy to say, well, if I just focused, I could have done my thesis much faster. But I also think that if I had just focused, I wouldn't have realized this is really what I want to do, and I might have spent the rest of my life wondering maybe I should work on these fiber optic many core machines.
Yeah, I guess I think probably a lot of us could imagine working on lots of different projects within, PL, compiler, software engineering. Like, we'll go to PLDI the rest of this week, and probably like, a large percentage of the talks will be very interesting to us, and we can imagine, I can imagine, trying to learn about and working in this area for years. And so, and again, part of the goal is to, become kind of a broad scholar and researcher where you're interested and know about and can work on many different things. And so, I think in a lot of cases, like, one's dissertation topic is, one of a couple or a few projects that they've worked on. And, it's okay if, you work on a few different things and then end up settling on something later on, as opposed to kind of going into it thinking this is like my most favorite problem that I'm going to work on. Again, Matt's probably back there. So one of his, blog posts said, it doesn't matter what you do a PhD in as much as that you do one, right? Because part of the process, part of the value is learning the process and learning how to think critically about, a problem and a set of problems. And so I guess, in my experience, it didn't seem like the particular topic was, as important as the set of things that I got to work on and can imagine working on in the future.
Just to echo to that, right? So in some sense, I think this is kind of like a chicken and egg problem, right? So if I can give you like the perfect research statement today and tell you like you should just work on A, B, C, and D and you'll be famous, you should just like call me out, right? That's not going to happen, right? Not only because like, I don't have that sort of hindsight, but also because of the fact that if I knew everything, then this is not really research, right? In some sense, kind of like if I knew the results, then it's not even new. So why are you working on something that is like, like either it's extremely incremental or it's basically known results, right? So in some sense, this kind of iterative process is by definition, you just have to go through this, right? Because that's how research is done.
Yeah, so my question is about when you hit that wall when you're doing research. Specifically, when you have pen and paper out and, you're trying to come up with a solution and it's just not coming. Sometimes I can, go and read another paper or read something else and eventually my brain will just click and I can go back to it. But other times I just need to, take a walk and get my mind erased for a little while. And I was just wondering how you guys deal with that.
Make it slightly more specific as well. Like, is there a particular time you were like super stuck, and what happened?
So have you guys heard of the term structured procrastination? So there's actually a website, structuredprocrastination.org, which someone did during a period of structured procrastination. But I feel like my life is just one giant structured procrastination. Like if you have more than one thing you're working on, you get stuck on one thing, you can always have another thing you're working on that you're not stuck on. And I found that really helpful. So I only mostly had one research project I was working on for a lot of my PhD, but I had a few other things that I worked on, and I would just do those things if I ever got stuck. And usually having something else that stimulates your mind is really good for getting you unstuck. So a lot of people ask me, like, how do you have all this time to blog? And it's like, well, usually if I'm blogging, I'm probably stuck on something else.
Yeah, and I guess ideally, like if you don't have a second completely different thing or project to work on, but you have a project where there's several different kind of questions or several different ideas that you're trying out, maybe you put one down for a day or a week or a month and kind of think about the other one. And so if you have a project where you can imagine making progress or thinking about several related different parts of it, so that you can make progress in one with one progress in the other is stalling. And when you can set, kind of like smaller short-term goals where you can help evaluate, is this really seeming to work, or is this something that, as phrased, maybe this problem is too hard to work on right now, and kind of, direct yourself to, a different approach.
Yeah, something that helps me get unstuck is when I find myself doing something and I just can't figure it out, it's getting too complicated, I'll try to start over and do it again in a dumber way. And a lot of times that'll just the fresh start and like trying to be like, what is the dumbest way possible to do this? Even if the dumbest way doesn't work, it might lead you into insights about what are the hard parts about this problem that will let you say, okay, I should abandon this, or maybe this I can fix it in this way, or something along those lines.
I was just going to add, or we were talking about balance before, right? So sometimes what works for me is just to do something else that I enjoy, and it doesn't have to be another project. So it could be, for example, I enjoy playing the piano, so I can just go and play for a while and clear my mind. And sometimes answers will come to me after. Sometimes, at least I have a break and I come back and I see things differently. So that might also work.
I had a question regarding evaluation. So, do you reach out to your advisor or lab mates for feedback on things you're doing right or things you're doing wrong in your research? And how often do you ask them for feedback? Do you ask them for feedback? And either your advisor or manager, and also if you are already an advisor, how often do you give feedback? How do you do that?
So I think that depends a lot on the individual and the kind of group that you're in, the advisor that you have, and whether you and your advisor like to meet once a week versus 1 month versus every day. And so I think there's a whole range. And again, a lot of people have said make sure you choose your advisor and kind of look for an advisor that you share research interests, but also like ways of communicating in the same ways. Like some advisors may not respond to emails that are more than 2 sentences, whereas some actually might want to work extensively by email. And so I think finding somebody who you can communicate with and can schedule meetings with you at your own kind of like comfort level, I think is important. And that, like, of course, depends on the particular person. And so, I would encourage you to find an environment where you can, present ideas and results with your colleagues as well as your advisor at a kind of frequency that you find valuable.
I guess related. So if in your group there are weekly meetings, maybe volunteering to present your results. So you don't have to wait until they are perfect. If you have a set of preliminary results, present them to your colleagues, to other students in the group. And I have found that that's a great way to think about maybe things that you didn't think about before, or at least explain what you found to others.
So one of the problems that I typically have when I'm starting a new project is that I suddenly start worrying about best practices. So for example, I'm writing a toy language compiler, and the other day I decided I wanted to test it, and so now I'm writing thousands of unit tests, and then I'm like, well, if I want this to be really nice, I should probably organize my project better. And so I started thinking about how I would distribute this project a little bit better, and now suddenly I realized I spent like a week doing something totally unrelated to the project that I was originally doing. How do you press a stop button? Like, where do you say, nope, I'm not going down that road. I'm gonna do very simple. I'm gonna make it work just well enough for me to like it, but it may not be best practices. It may not be the world's greatest thing.
Yeah, so I was working with Chris Hoblitzel summer after my first year of grad school, and I was having a similar conversation with him where I was saying, well, I don't know, should I write this function this way or that way? And I said a bunch of stuff, and then he looks at me and he says, just go code. And every time I start thinking about, do I do this or that, I just think of him saying, just go do it. And the look he had on his face was, I don't even understand why you're thinking about this. We just want to do it. And so I think a lot of the time, that's a good thing to think about. Like, you want to do something and then clean it up later. Having deadlines helps. If you say, I want to get this done before this paper deadline, you can always give yourself a week to clean up after paper deadlines. Yeah, actually, that's my only concrete advice for that.
Yeah, I think writing research quality code is a skill, one that's maybe not that useful outside of research, but a good one to have nonetheless. But I think basically the guideline I would use is like, you don't want it to be so bad that if you wanted to add something to it later, you'd have to rewrite it, but you don't want it to be so good that anyone in industry would consider using it under any circumstances.
Right. I wanted to add, so one piece of advice I have gotten, I got while being a grad student is do not optimize before you know you need to optimize. So that's one thing. The other thing I would say that maybe it might help is to allocate some time. If you don't want to get distracted by spending an infinite amount of time on something, allocate some time and say, I need to get this task done in a week. So, and so work on it.
One final thing to add, I mean, just learn how to code really, really fast. right? I mean, if that happens, then you can just write infinite amount of software in like no time, right? So that means you can do anything.
So I'm curious how you all decided between going into industry or academia, and whether when you were on the job market you were considering both, and kind of what your thoughts were on that.
We're trying to decide. This is hard. So I guess the short answer is yes. I was considering. So in grad school, what's nice is that you do get to write code. You get to build systems. You get to work on problems that sometimes allow you to kind of think outside the box. You also get to teach and work with other students. And so I personally enjoyed all of those aspects. And so I considered faculty positions both in research focused institutions as well as teaching focused ones, as well as industrial research labs where you've heard from Shan and John a little bit about that. And the honest answer is I don't really know how one goes about picking. They're all really, there's great options about all of them. Teaching is very rewarding and fun, and you don't get to do that in a research lab as much. In a research focused institution, there's just different priorities. And so personally, I think if you're interested in all those activities, in graduate school you can do things to kind of get experience and exposure to all of them. And I think there's a lot of flexibility in doing that. And so it's a useful time to experiment. And then at the end of the day, it comes down to if you have a set of options. Are you excited about the people that are there, about the opportunities that you have to, drive your own agenda, the kinds of projects that you imagine in the future? And I think it's a tough decision, but I think we're fortunate that there's lots of good decisions. I think in academics and in computer science in particular.
All right, so for me, so when I graduated back in 2012, I actually interviewed in all different kinds of jobs because I wasn't sure. And actually, at that time, I didn't want to be a professor, I thought. And once the opportunities were concrete, that I can go to this place, that's when it hit me that, oh, I don't feel too excited about those opportunities and I would like to explore more. I realized that I actually wanted to mentor students, to do more teaching, and then that's when I decided to actually do a postdoc to put more emphasis on that, because when I was a grad student, I didn't really put emphasis on that. So I used this postdoc opportunity. I was very excited about the postdoc, so I thought I was assigned, right? And then I spent 2 years doing the postdoc, and then I realized that I really wanted to do that. So in my second search, I focus on assistant professor positions.
Yeah, I think for me it was similar because I think in grad school also there's a lot of fear about staying in academia. People tell you like, oh, it's so much work, it's really competitive, you don't have a life anymore. And professors tell you reasons to stay in academia, but they always seemed really abstract. Like you have a lot of freedom, and it's really fun. And you're like, what does that really mean? And so I think at around my 6th year of my PhD, Armando said, it's time for you to get out there and be a professor. And I said, wait a minute, I haven't figured this out yet. And I really hadn't figured it out. But it's so my friend Seth likes to say the grass is brown everywhere, and so not saying that academia is bad, but I'm saying like people have complaints about academia. But I did a thorough survey of everything else, and it seems like there's good things and bad things about everything else too. And so after all that, I decided, you know what, academia actually seems like a pretty good option for me because given what I specifically want to work on, the opportunities, there just didn't seem that many opportunities in industry. In fact, I applied for some industry jobs and they said, well, you could work on this similar thing or this kind of related thing, but if you really want to work on this, you can't really do that here. And so that was kind of how I decided, if I really want to keep working on the stuff I've been thinking about, then I should probably stay in academia.
Yeah, the great part about about grad school is that you can just try out all of these options. You can do an internship at Microsoft Research to see if you like the way they do industrial research there. You can do internships at companies like Google or Facebook, and you can try teaching a class at your university. I just encourage you to try as many different things as possible and see which one feels like fits you. And I think the decision, it might not be easy, but you'll make a much more informed decision. There's not a lot of jobs where you can really try it on before you decide quite like you can in grad school.
Thank you, everyone. That takes us to the end of the time we have for the panel. You may have lots more questions. Feel free to reach out to any of us. I think we'd be happy to talk with you during the conference, or maybe even over email. I just want to check with the panelists. Anything you wish you had said? Last chance to get some nuggets of wisdom. There's some good ones there, so maybe I'll read them down. Just checking. All right. Thank you. Let's say thanks to